Kwame Nkrumah remains a towering figure in African history. Inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's non-violent campaign of civil disobedience to achieve political ends, he led present-day Ghana to independence in 1957. In today's episode, at African Account, I'll be looking at the life of Nkrumah, who made Ghana a beacon of hope for not only Ghanaians, but also people of African descent throughout the world. Kwame Nkrumah was born in Nkrumah in the Nzima region, or was at the time the British colony of the Gold Coast. His father was a goldsmith who had many wives, but Nkrumah was the only child born to his mother. He was educated in local missionary schools and then in 1926 attended the government training college in Accra, the capital of today's Ghana, where he trained as a teacher. After graduating in 1930, Nkrumah worked as a teacher, but he also considered training for the priesthood. In 1935, Nkrumah moved to Britain and then to the United States to study at Lincoln University. He then completed postgraduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania. After completing his studies, Nkrumah was employed as a teacher of political science at Lincoln University. It was during this time in the United States that Nkrumah became politically active, obviously influenced by those he came into contact with at the university and at the meetings of various political organizations, including Marcus Garvey's UNIA, the Council on African Affairs, and the American Communist Party. It was also in the United States that Nkrumah became active in the African Students Association, which was formed in 1941 by West African students, the majority from Nigeria and Ghana. Nkrumah was elected as president of this organization, wrote for his publication African Interpreter, and spoke at numerous meetings. In 1942, he demanded that the African Students Association should be open to all Africans, not just students. It also seemed that during this period, he began to advocate to many of his Pan-African views, often in opposition to other members of the African Students Association. In 1945, Nkrumah went to London, ostensibly to study at London University. He became an active member of the West African Students' Union and was soon elected its vice president. He met and worked with the Trinidadian Pan-Africanist George Blackmore of the Pan-African Federation and threw himself into organizing the historic Manchester Pan-African Congress. It also seemed that it was in the UK that he began using the name Kwame and to associate with all those in the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movement. Nkrumah played a prominent role in the planning of the Pan-African Congress and claimed to have drafted the famous declaration to the colonial peoples of the world, which called for the unity of all colonial people against imperialism. Following the Congress, Nkrumah was one of the founders and General Secretary of the West African National Secretariat, formed with a view to realizing a West African Front for United West African Independence, and was the chief editor of the organization's magazine. He also became the leader of the Circle, a secret revolutionary organization dedicated to establishing a union of African socialist republics. During this period, Nkrumah traveled to Paris to meet the Senegalese politician Léopold Senghor and other African members of the French National Assembly and discuss plans for West African unity. During his time in the UK, Nkrumah also became involved with the British Communist Party. It was also during his time in the UK that Nkrumah published his book Towards Colonial Freedom, which is an analysis of colonialism and imperialism and what he termed a call for the organization of the colonial masses to achieve independence. In his book, Nkrumah described the essential need for the complete national unity of the West African colonies to achieve independence. Now, it's worthwhile to mention that at this stage in his life, he was more preoccupied with West African unity rather than continental African unity. In his view, he saw the former as a device to achieve the latter. In 1947, Nkrumah left the UK when he was asked to become the General Secretary of the Anti-Colonial Gold Coast Convention, also known as UGCC, which had been formed by constitutional nationalists in the Gold Coast in August of that same year. On his way back to the Gold Coast, Nkrumah held several meetings with political and trade union leaders in Sierra Leone and Liberia and continued to campaign for West African unity. In 1948, rioting and demonstrations by workers and ex-servicemen led to the declaration of a state of emergency inside the Gold Coast. Now, Nkrumah's UGCC had not organized a riot, although it did seek to make political capital out of them, and Nkrumah and 6 other UGCC leaders were arrested and imprisoned. Now this was a good thing for Nkrumah because the arrest raised his profile, but it also highlighted political differences between him and other more conservative UGCC leaders. These differences led to Nkrumah's demotion to treasurer and prompted him to first establish the Committee of Youth Organization, where he founded the newspaper Accra Evening News, and then in June 1949, the Convention People's Party, also known as CPP. Now, the CPP demanded what they termed self-government now and began to mobilize trade unionists, farmers, Youth and Ex-Servicemen Association for this particular goal. In 1950, Nkrumah announced a campaign of positive action, which was a campaign to fight against imperialism through non-violence. This led to a series of strikes and demonstrations throughout the colony. The colonial authorities again declared the state of emergency, and he was arrested and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. Even in prison, Nkrumah's leadership role and popularity was still high, and he successfully stood in the 1951 general election, winning over 90% of the votes cast. In 1951, he was released from prison to become leader of government business, and from 1952, Prime Minister of Ghana. Nkrumah and the CPP continued to win elections held in 1954 and 1956 and led the country to internal self-rule, and then formal independence in March 1957. Once independence was declared, the colonial name Gold Coast was formally renamed to Ghana, and Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence. On Independence Day, Nkrumah told the jubilant crowd in the capital Accra, "Today, there's a new African in the world. This African is ready to fight his own battle and manage his own affairs." In 1960, following a referendum, the adoption of a new constitution and general election, Nkrumah became Ghana's first president and was re-elected to this post unchallenged in 1965. Nkrumah held the view in which he declared on many occasions that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it's linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. With this view in mind, he convened the Accra Conference of Independent African States in 1958, and at the end of the same year, the first All-African People's Conference, a precursor of the Organization of African Unity. The following year, Nkrumah helped to establish an economic union with the former French colony of Guinea, and in 1960, this union was joined by independent Mali, another French colony. Nkrumah also began to draft plans for a wider union of African states. But his Pan-African ideas were opposed by more conservative African countries at the Second Conference of African States held in Ethiopia in 1960. Nkrumah was a passionate supporter of the Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba during the crisis in the Congo and spoke out on many occasions against the conduct of the UN inside the Congo. Because of his grievance with the UN, he approached 9 other African states with the intention of forming an African Joint High Command that might intervene in future African crises. In 1961, Nkrumah took part in the famous Casablanca Conference of Progressive African States, which condemned neo-colonialism, and despite the differences that emerged between the Casablanca group and more conservative African states, he was able to play a significant role in the creation of the Organization of African Unity in Ethiopia in 1963. Nkrumah's Ghana gave significant support to those fighting against colonial rule in Africa. He adopted a policy of non-alignment in foreign affairs and forged close ties with some socialist countries, including China and the Soviet Union. He declared in his autobiography the need for a socialist society for a newly independent nation. But despite attempts to industrialize and diversify the economy, his government found it increasingly difficult to solve those economic, political, and social problems that were a legacy of colonial rule. Nkrumah's popularity declined as a consequence of economic problems, continued interference by the UK and the USA, and an increasingly corrupt and autocratic government. According to intelligence documents released by the US Department of State of the historian, Nkrumah was doing more to undermine US government interests than any other black African. In 1961, there were bomb attacks, and in the following years, a number of attempts to assassinate Nkrumah, who in 1964 banned opposition parties and declared Ghana a one-party state. In 1966, when Nkrumah was on his way to a peace mission in Vietnam, his government was overthrown by a military coup. Nkrumah went into exile in Guinea, where the president of Guinea, Secretary, made him a co-president. Following the coup, Ghana realigned itself internationally, cutting its close ties to Guinea and the Eastern Bloc and accepting a new friendship with the Western Bloc and inviting the IMF and World Bank to take a lead role in managing the economy. With this reversal emphasized by the expulsion of immigrants and a new willingness to negotiate with apartheid South Africa, Ghana lost a good deal of its stature in the eyes of African nationalists. For a time, Nkrumah called on his fellow Ghanaians to overthrow the military regime. But when such appeals went unheeded, he spent much of the remainder of his life writing. After some years of being critically ill, he died of cancer in Romania in 1972. Even after his death, Nkrumah continued to be a controversial figure. The institutional transformation of the Organization of African Unity into an African Union in July 2002 is one of the enduring legacies of the Nkrumah's political thinking. 34 years since his death. He was at first buried in Guinea and then in his home village in Ghana. In 1994, he received an official reburial in a special mausoleum in Accra. In 2000, he was voted African Man of the Millennium by listeners to the BBC World Service, being described by the BBC as a hero of independence and an international symbol of freedom as the leader of the first black African country to shake off the chains of colonial rule. According to many experts, Nkrumah's politics contributed to the fact that Ghana today remains a largely stable country. It never collapsed into civil strife like many of its neighbors, despite a series of military takeovers in the 1970s and 1980s. His view that we are all Ghanaians, that we have one country, and the country must be stable, remains arguably one of his most important legacies. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And while you're at it, let me know your thoughts and feedback on the life and legacy of Kwame Nkrumah in the comments below. Thanks for watching and see you next week.